Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Mayra. I'm a solutions engineer here at Grafana Labs, and I am so excited to be a part of LEAP 2024. Today's session is going to centralize around talking about the RED or RED method and how you can really leverage this method to streamline your root cause analysis, and also what tools are going to be necessary to get you there. So let's start off with, what is the RED method, right? So the RED method was actually forged by Grafana's CTO, Tom Wilkie, around 2015, where he noticed that there was a gap in monitoring philosophy centered around microservices. And so what started out as a funny little acronym really became fundamental to the way that Grafana approaches observability and has really withstood the test of time. So let's break this down just a little bit further. Let's start with R, rate. So rate is going to refer to requests per second. If you have a system with a high request per second, it's likely going to provide a smoother, more responsive experience for your users because it can handle a high number of requests effectively and quickly. Then we take a look at errors, and errors refers to the number of requests that are failing. And not only can this indicate something a little more obvious, like timeouts or failed transactions, they can actually be a sign that your service is either partially or completely unavailable. And then lastly, the last one that we're going to talk about is duration. And duration refers to the amount of time that those requests take to complete. This metric can indicate not only the speed that your user is experiencing, right? So potentially a slow application or a slow website, but also can indicate some resource bottlenecks. So when we combine all three of these metrics, we can actually get insight not only into the health of our application, but almost more importantly, a quick cognitive understanding of the customer experience. But when should we use the RED method? So it's going to be, in reality, really important that you collect these three metrics for every single one of your services. This is not only going to give you insight into those individual services, but also it's going to start to establish a uniform, scalable, repeatable strategy that is going to grow with you and your application. That being said, the RED method is most commonly applied to request-driven services and applications, but that's not to say, as you can see from this chart here, that this method can't be applied to at least consider some form of rate, error, and duration for everything else that you use. If you're still not convinced about the value of the RED method, then I want you to consider how it could potentially help you in the future when you start to establish SLO goals. So SLAs, or service level agreements, are a fundamental agreement between you and your users. It kind of sets that customer expectation, but also lets your team know which issues they're responsible for and in what priority. SLIs, which stands for service level indicators, are going to be the metrics that you determine or that you select to determine whether you are meeting the agreement that you defined. Tying this back, because the RED method is so centralized around how happy customers are, they actually make really, really great metrics to measure your SLAs. So how are we going to accomplish this? Here at Grafana, we stand behind the open source community 110%. And so I wanted to make sure that I focused today's talk on some of the tools and technologies that you would have available open source to accomplish this right after this presentation. The first tool in any observability, or I should say the first step in any observability strategy, is going to actually be getting the telemetry within a visualization tool such as Grafana. So let's talk about OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry is a set of protocols, instrumentation libraries, you have agents, you have even a collector. And there are so many different options for architecting and deploying OpenTelemetry. So you can instrument your code and basically start emitting telemetry in OTel format that you can then forward to the OTel collector and eventually a backend. But you have the option to skip the collector and send the data straight from your application to your backend. Because this is going to be a really important decision that we have to think through, I have actually included a blog article at the end of the presentation that you can read through to really help decide whether the collector is the right method for you or not. But why are we even talking about OTel today anyway? So OTel is really taking the observability world by storm because of its vendor agnostic approach, right? And so if we start our observability journey with OpenTelemetry, we could save time, headaches, and a lot of migration pain as our strategies not only start to evolve and change, but potentially our tool belt starts to grow. So especially of those of us who might be earlier in our observability journey, OTel is also going to provide some standard for us to follow, right? So like a collection of best practices to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And similar to Grafana, OTel is rooted in being open source. And what does that mean? That not only means that you can get started today, but it also means that you are going to have a huge community backing to get support, to get advice, to learn from their experiences. And if the community hasn't found the answer or hasn't run into the problem, vendors are now really investing themselves into OpenTelemetry and providing support. And speaking of vendors, I wanted to point out, I think this slide really just goes to show how big of an impact OpenTelemetry is making, right? So even more than Grafana, over 40 plus vendors now support OpenTelemetry to some capacity. And in addition to that, you can see on the left here, you have almost 700 integrations for you to leverage as your application starts to mature. This matters because with such a wide range of integrations, and as you can see here, it spans programming languages, frameworks, libraries, even services, right? OpenTelemetry is going to be able to provide you that comprehensive coverage, regardless of how diverse your technology is or how diverse your technology stack is today, or how diverse it will become in the future. So I really want us to get us thinking not only about our current state, but also our future state. The next technology that I wanted to talk about is Tempo. So Grafana Tempo is an open source, highly scalable distributed tracing backend. And it can ingest common open source tracing protocols, including Jaeger, Zipkin, and arguably most important to our conversation today, OpenTelemetry. We're not going to dive too far into Tempo today, but I did want to talk about and go through a feature that I think will help us hit the ground running as far as the red method is concerned. And that is Grafana's metric generator. So the metrics generator actually uses the data that you have in Tempo to generate metrics from traces. We have three different sets of processors within what we like to call the metrics generator. And the one that I want to discuss specifically today is the one called span metrics processor. So the span metrics processor is going to be responsible for generating those three metrics that we talked about previously for every single combination of dimensions, whether it's service name, the operation, the status code, basically any tag or attribute present in that span. Now, I want to pause here. And because I want you to start forward thinking about the future, I think it's important to point out that you should be on the lookout for something that I like to refer to as too much of a good thing. So the more dimensions that are enabled within your spans, the higher the cardinality is going to be of those generated metrics. And so I highly, highly encourage you, if you get to this stage in your observability strategy, to check out some of the great cardinality management blogs that Grafana has published to help you kind of tackle this problem. This span metrics processor that we just went over is designed to mirror something that OTel actually already has with the same name. So OTel has something called the span metrics connector. And this really should be seen as another method of getting those same RED metrics. So multiple options. Lastly, before we get into our meat and potatoes demo that I know everyone is really excited for, I wanted to take things one step further. So not only get notified in spikes of RED metrics, right? Like let's pinpoint where the latencies are within our code and optimize our application performance from there, right? And how are we going to accomplish this? So Grafana Pyroscope is the answer. And Grafana Pyroscope is an open source continuous profiling database. You can think of it as the profiling equivalent that Tempo is to tracing. It's going to allow us to do faster incident response resolution because it does give us that code level insight. And then in addition to that, we can also do a little bit of cost cutting because it's going to help us identify where we have some resource hotspots. But the main point that I wanted to discuss today for our purposes is the fact that we're going to be able to look at our data, our profiles, identify any latency issues that need changing within our code, potentially compare it to a better performing piece of code, and make the changes that we deem necessary. This is not only going to help us achieve those SLAs that we keep mentioning and that we want to do in the future, but it's going to actually help us ensure that our customers stay happy and have a good experience using our application. All right, the moment you've all been waiting for, let's get into the demo. So this is monitoring our Mythical Ink application. You'll notice that the dashboard is comprised of panels that visualize a lot of the metrics that we talked about today. We have request rate here on the left, and that's really going to point out when we have spikes or dips in the volume of HTTP requests. And you'll notice that we actually broke it out by service. So that's a best practice that we follow here at Grafana. We always want to make sure that we have visibility into the overall application, but also into that granular service level application. Next, we're going to be talking about error. So I want to divert your eyes to the right here. And you can see this panel is called overall error percentage. And so this is a counter that is going to, or this is a metric that is going to alert us if our overall error percentage exceeds a certain threshold. And I wanted to point out, I have a lot of prospects who think that overall error percentage is enough to get them observability to where they want it to be. And I want to bring this to your attention because, again, I'm just trying to make sure that we're all thinking about the future. So say, for instance, like in this example here, our overall error percentage is not surpassing the threshold that we established. However, if we take a look, we can actually see that our service account is almost twice as, has almost twice as many error percentages as the other targets. So imagine that instead of 5.8, this is actually 100, and the service is actually completely unavailable. But because account might be called less than all of the other services, it might get drowned out when we calculate overall error percentage. Now, this is definitely something that we're going to want to get insight into. So this is why we try to really hone in on the fact that you should not only be having overall visibility to establish that things are generally good, but also to break everything out by service. Scrolling down a little bit, let's divert over here. I think this is a really great example. So this panel is top 10 highest endpoint latencies over the last minute. Now you'll notice that this is a little less visually stimulating than a lot of the other panels that we have on this dashboard. And that's actually why I love to highlight it. Because even though at first glance, it might not have all the razzle dazzle, I think it's a great example of how we can very quickly see where we're having the highest latencies, see the endpoint and the HTTP method. We get a lot of information that we need at a quick glance. And that's going to be super important when you're creating dashboards. You want to understand the information as quickly and easily as possible. So for something like rankings that are so dependent on ever-changing metrics and are, dependent one compared to the other, it's going to be important to have them in list form to identify as quickly as possible. The last panel that I wanted to point out here is the 95th percentile response latencies. A couple of things that I wanted to note about this panel. So as far as best practices go, having latency is something that we're going to want to do based on percentiles and not average. For lack of a better word, we don't really want to concern ourselves with what the average user is experiencing per se. But what is impactful is to say, okay, 95%, 99% of your users are experiencing this kind of performance, right? This also starts to creep up on a topic that we've hit on a couple of times now, which is service level objectives. So making sure that a certain percentage of your users are having a certain quality of experience is how you start to establish SLOs. So let me just open up this panel to give you a better understanding. We actually have alerts that are related to this dashboard as a whole. And that's going to be step 2, right? So we want the observability, we want the visibility into our systems, and then we want to start thinking proactively. I want to get alerted the second these things happen. I don't want my users to tell me about it. So if I open up these alerts, you can actually see that we have the baseline, right? We have an alert for request rate, we have an alert for high latency, but now we want to start thinking a little more advanced and a little more forward thinking. So we've actually established an alert based off response time for our specific payment service. So if that experience is going below the objective that we have defined, we are going to get alerted on it. One thing that we didn't touch on today, but is another example of the way that you could be thinking about this in a more forward-thinking way, is these 2 machine learning forecasts. And so let's take the metrics that we're collecting today for request rate and start to create a machine learning forecast that can predict what these request rates should be, and then can alert us proactively if there's any anomalous behavior. Now that is going to be really impactful because you're starting to work on your application and getting things solved before the customer even experiences it. So you can see how we can start with red method and then grow into something that we can really, really be proud of and call an observability strategy. So let's go back to the original dashboard. So this dashboard looks like it's created from metrics, right? And I'm going to open up this panel just to prove to you that we are, in fact, not only using traces, but then the processor that we used is the span metrics processor. And so we took those traces and generated metrics from them, and then we stored those metrics in our metrics backend, for example, Mimir. We can then leverage these metrics to create dashboards like this, but they do originate from traces. So just to wrap up this part of the demo, this dashboard, I think, is a great example of how the RED method gives us an understanding to our user experience. So just by referencing it very quickly, I can know what my user experience is. For instance, if I see that all my error percentages are really large, I know that they're probably experiencing page load errors, or that a service might potentially be unavailable and that I'm going to hear about it, right? And so while we start here, I really want you to get to that proactive approach where your users aren't telling you, hey, like I'm getting a lot of page load errors, you know, because you're being alerted on and you're already working on it. So let's go into the last part that I wanted to show you. And this is, again, taking it one step further. We're now further into the future of your observability. I'm going to break out this rideshare example application based on region. And so based on CPU, you can see that the EU North is using up a lot more CPU than both of the other regions. As we scroll down, Pyroscope is going to give us a really good understanding of what our code is doing line by line, both with something a little more visual, like we talked about earlier, but also something a little more intuitive and a little easier to read. And so we're able to filter these and make sure that they're sorted by highest latency, lowest latency, whatever you prefer. And then this flame graph gives you a good idea visually of where you're seeing the highest latencies. However, individual evaluation of each of these is not really going to help us improve the EU North, right? So I think it'd be more useful if we set the baseline as US East, because we can see that that's performing okay, and then see what's different in EU North that could be causing this. So as I click compare tags, you'll see that it'll draw a side-by-side comparison. These graphs up here are going to be particularly interesting if you want to dive into a spike potentially and see what the difference was between 2 pieces of code. This could also work if there's specific comparisons that you want to draw, not only regionally, right, but you can make this your own, and it could be code versions to see if you had a more efficient piece of code earlier, to see what the changes were and what could be re-implemented to get back to that standard. But even here, having these visualizations side by side, we can see that the order car is much longer in the EU than it is here in the US. And though this is visually obvious in this example, that's not always the case. So we can see here that this order car request was 1.2 minutes. And then in the EU, it was 12.9 minutes, right? We were luckily able to identify this visually very quickly, but I want to go back and give you an alternative scenario where we actually do the difference. So same definition, our baseline, the one that we want to get to is US East, and then our problem child is EU North. When we compare these tags, you'll see that this looks a little different. We still have the time range comparisons for spike analysis, but I want to point out that we now have the difference between these. So if I were to filter the differences from greatest to least, you can see here, the first one that isn't new and actually has a percent difference is in fact what we were looking at earlier, which is the order car request. And you can see that it's actually gotten worse from the US comparison to the EU by 180%. This is the type of insight that's going to help us improve our code to be as efficient as possible. And so this is a great example of how we can take what we've learned in US East, implement it in EU so that our application experience is as best as possible everywhere. Okay. I really appreciate everyone joining me today. I curated a little list here of reading materials that anyone who enjoyed the presentation today can take a look at, and the QR code there will actually direct you to links to make it more easy. And we also have a couple of questions. So let's take a look here. The first question that we have is there anything more out of the box that we can use to get started? Definitely. So if getting up and running is the priority here, we have a couple of options. I want to start out by pointing out that I always recommend referencing Grafana's documentation on how to instrument everything from day one, because we talked about best practices and how that's going to have repercussions in the future. So the first step is always going to make sure that your instrumentation and your deployments are as efficient as possible. In addition to that, though, taking it a step further, you can actually go to grafana.com/dashboards. We have a whole library of dashboards that you can download, use, and more importantly, customize to your specific use case. And they make a great starting point to creating these types of dashboards. And those are available generally for everyone. Now, if you're looking for something a little more on the enterprise solutions side of things, we do offer application observability. It is a feature for our Grafana cloud users, and we didn't get a chance to demo that today, but basically it breaks out your services in this list form and collects the RED metrics for each of these services and allows you to drill downstream and upstream to see exactly where the latency happened between your services. And so it's a great way to correlate between all of them. And though we didn't get a chance to demo that today, I'm 100% sure that any of the solutions engineers here at Grafana would be more than happy to chat about it or even demo it. So please do reach out if that's of interest. The second question that we have here is the RED the new method to replace the use method, the USE method? Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, the use method actually stands for utilization, saturation, and errors. It's actually funny that this is brought up because originally when our CTO, Tom, started popularizing the red method, a lot of people thought that he was trying to replace the use method, and that's absolutely not the case. And I think it's important to distinguish the difference. So if you are familiar with the use method, you'll know that it works really well with hardware. As I mentioned at the beginning, the reason the red method was even developed was because we had this gap in philosophy that didn't include microservices. And so we're really talking about two different things. And actually, it's funny that this is mentioned because Tom touches this in the talk that I have in the reading material here. But the RED method is absolutely in no way meant to replace the use method. And in fact, here at Grafana, we encourage people to leverage both, right? So ensure that your hardware is happy and ensure that your customer experience is good. It's two sides to ensure that everything is working efficiently and well. So if this is of interest of you, or if this is of interest to you, I highly encourage you to take a peek at that first link that I added to the reading material here. Okay, I appreciate everyone joining today. Like I said, if you have any questions or would just like to talk about this further, please reach out. I'm more than happy to connect with you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.